Okay, hello everybody. This is Bob Coppedge with Simplex-IT, and welcome to, and Patty, I know you did some last best practices or project scheduling. Oh, I apologize. But welcome to our March webinar for project management, where we're going to be talking about best practices for project scheduling. And thank you very much. And I don't know if anybody was there. We actually had our luncheon hour yesterday for Windows 10. Um, and we had about 30 people in-house and about 10 more people online. So it was really cool. So anyway, so we'll go through our traditional NASCAR slide, which shows you all the wonderful things. Simplex IT, for the most part, is what was referred to as managed service provider. We want to be your IT department, but we have a couple of programs, and this is one of them, where we also want to help you with your project management programs. And we have all these wonderful logos that we can add as far as how wonderful we are, blah, blah, blah. Okay, so go on to the next one, Patty. And this is, of course, we have to put this down there. Why would you use us for or as your IT department? Um, Again, part of our big value that we try to add is that we really do try to educate and share our knowledge with our customers, and these webinars that we do is one of the main ways we do that. So yada yada yada. All right, and the next one. And as we've been saying, we're adding these two new practices, one of which is Patty's practice, which is the Simplex-PM, where again, we use tools such as mentoring, working with you guys, looking over your shoulders. So it's not just consultants coming in from the outside, and it's not just training with the tools. So we think it's a much different approach, and we'd love to talk to you and your organizations if we can help you out with that. And then the final thing before I shut up is this is the schedule for the rest of this month, and then for April. We have next Tuesday, I believe, is what do we talk about when we talk about a corporate data review? And then we've got throughout April, we have the various webinars that you can see there. All of these are free. They're all open to the public, and they also end up on YouTube as well if you can't attend or have some issues. So I think that is it from my standpoint. So Patty, if you're ready.
Thanks, Bob. Good afternoon, everyone. I'm having technical difficulties advancing slides. I can assure you that I'm a better project manager than I am slide advancer. It seemed like every. Thank you for joining us this afternoon. Today we're going to talk about some best practices for project scheduling, not or, like my typo indicated in the title slide. But these are just general guidelines that we follow when creating project schedules. Of course, there's always going to be exceptions to the rule. So these are, like I said, just general guidelines. I've got some examples for us as we go through each one, but I would love to hear some feedback as well. So in the chat area, if you have any questions as we're going through, please feel free to ask them. Bob will keep track of those, and we'll get to those at the end. If you have anything that, maybe we talk about and you have a real life example of something that worked for you, or something that didn't work, certainly feel free to share that. I love to get that feedback from everybody, and that's how we all learn. So the first best practice, and this one is sort of general, but typically tasks should be a reasonable duration based on the size of the overall project. So typically our tasks are between usually 8 and 40 hours or 8 and 80 hours, depending on who you talk to, for the most part. Anything smaller than that is usually too granular, and anything larger than that is too big to manage. So if you're managing tasks that are 3 months long, and you can't quite figure out, okay, am I halfway complete or am I 25% complete? It might be better to break those up into smaller, more manageable pieces. And then on the flip side of that as well, if you find that you've got, a fairly small project, but you've got 4,000 lines of tasks because, you have a task for every 15-minute, a task item for every 15-minute task, then that might be too much. Sure, that information is great to know, but you sort of have to balance how much time you want to put into managing the schedule versus what you're going to get out of it. So, are you really going to get a lot of value out of those out of those 15-minute tasks. And bear with me, I'm going to do a little bit of bouncing back and forth here between the presentation and my example project. And so here we have, I had a lot of fun making this. I named it the world's worst schedule because I intentionally went in and tried to create all of my anti-best practices. So here I have an example of a couple tasks that are probably a little too detailed for us. So if I were managing a project of washing my car, I might have separated out, I might separate it out by interior and exterior. That's probably enough. If you go into the detail of separating it and creating a task for vacuuming the floor, vacuuming the seats, cleaning the windows, wiping off the dashboard, scraping off your melted tube of chapstick that was there from last summer, that might be a little bit too much detail. But again, these are just general guidelines, so it's up to you. Of course, with larger projects that take 2, 3, 4 years, you may have larger tasks. If you're managing a project that takes a month, you may find that you have smaller tasks. So you just have to use your judgment on that. The next one we have is assigning tasks to named resources. So actual real people, not just general teams or departments. So when you assign a task to an individual person, I feel like it creates a little bit more visibility to that person. You'll notice here Paul Brown is supposed to vacuum the floor. And it gives them a little bit more accountability. They know that they're responsible for that task. Sometimes if we use general resources such as, somebody in accounting or even worse, just contractor, that's very general, we don't get the level of buy-in or, the ownership from our resources. So I like to see individual named resources. Of course, accountant is better than nothing, but if possible, if you actually know who's going to be doing that task, then I usually will try to plug their name in. In the cases where I don't know, or if I just know that, somebody from programming is going to do this task for me, then, of course, we just work with what we have. The next one that I have here are true task dependencies. So this one is, I think, really important. So task dependencies, we're all familiar with creating task dependencies, right? Finish to start relationships, task 1 finishes, task 2 starts. What I think sometimes happens, and I know I'm guilty of this, is we'll go through and just create task dependencies throughout the entire project, all finish to start, because it creates a nice Gantt chart and everything sort of flows evenly one right after the other. However, sometimes there aren't true dependencies. Like for example, here I have the tasks that I have highlighted here: create presentation, proofread presentation, and print presentation. Well, those are true dependencies. I can't proofread a presentation until I create it, and I certainly can't print it until I proofread it. So those are true task dependencies. The ones below it, graphics for slide 1, slide 2, slide 3, those, I don't necessarily have to wait for graphics for slide 1 to finish before I move on to slide 2. It might be nice, maybe I prefer to finish one thing before I move on to the other, or my resources prefer to do them one at a time, but there's nothing in slide 1 that is preventing me from working on slide 2. So in that case, they really shouldn't be linked together unless there's really a true dependency. There's something in that task that's preventing me from moving on to the next task. The next one I have here are good realistic estimates, and this is a tough one. As project managers, we don't always know what a good realistic estimate is. Let's face it, we rely on our subject matter experts and our team members to give us their input on our task estimates. So I will usually stick to about 6 to 6.5 hours of work a day, because chances are, our resources, our folks are working on other things. They're not just working on your project tasks for 8 hours a day. There's other operational things that they do. They answer the phone, go to other meetings, what have you. So that is the fastest way I've seen project schedules get off track and off schedule, is by trying to plan for 8 hours of work a day. So I like to err on the side of caution and stick with 6. 6.5 is what the PMI standard is. So either way, just be cautious of that when you're scheduling work for a day. But also be cautious in how you're communicating with your resources. Another thing that happens when we're trying to get estimates from resources is some resources will just inherently think in terms of work. They'll think, okay, it'll take me 8 hours to do that task. And other resources think in terms of duration. It'll take me 8 hours to do that task. Well, that can be 2 different periods of time. So one resource, it might take them a week to get around to doing those 8 hours if they work on it a little bit here and a little bit there. Another resource might do it, in 8 solid hours or 4 and 4. So you really want to have those conversations and make sure that you're both speaking the same language. The next one I have is using constraints sparingly. So this is another great one, and I love this because we tend to overuse constraints just as much as we overuse task linking. So, for example, if I have, here's a great constraint, and this kind of goes in with another one that we have coming up here about entering the start dates. So for this task, I have graphics for slide 1, and I actually have entered a constraint. And constraints can be added just by double-clicking on a task and going into the Advanced tab and selecting a constraint. Okay? And constraints are usually created for scheduling purposes or resource requirements or project demands. So here, if you have to have a task that must start on a specific date, this is where you would add it, or must finish on a specific date, or what have you. I will tell you the first 2 constraints are pretty flexible. They're not really constraints. As a matter of fact, the as soon as possible is the default constraint. The next several are semi-flexible. Finish no earlier than, no later than. Those aren't too specific. It's the must starts on and the must finishes on that are really specific. And by all means, if there's a time in your schedule where something has to start on a certain day or has to finish by a certain day, certainly don't hesitate to use constraints. But if it's just a preference on your part, or if it's a nice to have, I want to have this chapter 4 done by this date, then maybe consider using deadlines instead of constraints. And deadlines are just right above. You can select a deadline date, and then that actually puts a little arrow indicator in your Gantt chart to show you when that deadline has passed. So not as many to choose from as constraints. You just have the one deadline option. But again, it allows more flexibility in the scheduling. The reason why I say don't overuse constraints is because project likes to move things around in your schedule. And sometimes that's a good thing, and sometimes it's frustrating for us. But for example, if I try to add in a constraint, or maybe I try to change a date here, sometimes I'll get scheduling errors that say, oh, you can't do that because of this constraint. This has a constraint. It has to start on this date, which is great if you really truly need it to start on that date. If you don't, then it gets frustrating when your tasks don't move around like you are expecting them to. The next one here sort of plays into the previous, and it's don't enter start and finish dates. And this is really a common, I think a common misunderstanding when it comes to project. A lot of folks that I talk to will open up a new project and start entering their task names, and they'll enter the duration, and they'll enter the start date and the finish date. And when we do that, when we enter the start date and the finish date, project automatically creates a constraint for us. So you'll notice down here, if I enter a sample task, and I enter a date of, let's just say, tomorrow, you'll notice that I get a constraint in my indicator column. So it's saying it cannot start any earlier than 3:20. Many people I've talked to never realized that by entering a start date here, it actually creates a constraint automatically for you. It's a great feature, quote unquote. So just be cautious of that, because sometimes we create them inadvertently. And of course, if we do that, then we don't get the flexibility of our tasks moving around. Okay. This one, I joke because I don't know if it's a best practice. It's a pet peeve of mine for sure. So we'll call it a best practice for our for our purpose today. But it's nested task names, and I've created an example here in my presentation, and you can see it here, starting on line 18. So if I've got, or line 19, I should say. So if I've got a task that says phase 1. And I have some summary tasks underneath that. So I've created an outline, I've got a level. There's really no need to replace, or I'm sorry, to repeat phase 1. So I don't need to say phase 1 example, phase 1 example 1, phase 1 example 1, scenario 1, and so on. The problem is, it's fine when you've got lots of screen space and you can see it. But if you keep nesting these and you have longer names than I do, pretty soon all you see is phase 1, phase 1, phase 1. You just see the beginning of those task names. So if at all possible, try not to repeat those. If you have to, maybe use an abbreviation or put the repeated text at the end. So maybe example 1, phase 1, or scenario 1, example 1, phase 1. Reverse it so that if you're forced to truncate that text, you'll still be able to see what that task says. And for those of you that are using Project Web Access or Project Online, this is very important in your team members role. So for team members that go and access their My Tasks view, a lot of times I hear this from them that their columns, they're not able to see all of the text in their task name column because of the repeated text there. Okay, the next one I have is good use of milestone tasks. So I like to use milestone tasks as part of almost like a closure of a phase. So for a milestone, I might have, I have one here on task 17, celebrate. So I've cleaned my car, I've cleaned the interior, I've cleaned the exterior, and then I have a milestone task of celebrate. These are great for reporting. They're great to link to throughout your project schedule. Just a nice way to kind of close out that phase and say, yep, it's complete. I'm also kind of particular, and I don't know where this came from, if it was back in the earlier project years, but I always like to italicize my milestones. They just stand out, and of course you can do that for all milestones very easily. You may have another preference if you like to change color or what have you. I just like to do that so that they stand out a little bit. This is another one of my favorites, keeping your tasks and your schedule up to date. A project schedule, it does nobody any good when it just sits on a shelf and collects dust. So once you create your project schedule, that schedule is yours. That's your tool to use throughout your project schedule. And if there's a task that takes a little bit longer, then that project schedule will show you how the rest of the project is affected by it. That's one of the nice features of project. Or if a task takes a shorter amount of time and you update your project, that's one of the things that you'll be able to see is how it affects the rest of your schedule. So many people have told me that, oh, it's, I don't need to create a project schedule. I never use it. It's a waste of time, what have you. But if you keep it updated and you use it throughout the project to see how those changes are impacting your finish date and your budget, it really becomes a valuable tool. The next one I have is letting your schedule determine your completion dates. Okay. So, and I like this term, chunk it out, that I used here. So this is sort of a tough one because so many times as project managers, we know that we should fully plan our project and consult our subject matter experts, and and enter all of our tasks and determine when our finish date will be. But more often than not, we don't have that luxury. Somebody says, okay, can you do this project? I need it done by this date. And so those are the parameters that we have to work with. I usually will still plan a project schedule just like I normally would, whether or not they give me a deadline date, because then that's my supporting document to go back and say, no, we really looked at this and this is the amount of time it's going to take, and this is, when we estimate it'll be complete. Until you do that, it's often very difficult to have those conversations. It's hard to go back to your manager or your client or whoever that person might be and have those negotiations. So if you have everything in a schedule with real live realistic estimates, all of your tasks listed, resources assigned, links where they are appropriate, you've got that support, you've got something for them to look at, and you can say, okay, this is what we have to do. You want it done 2 months earlier than what this project schedule is saying, so what can we do? Can we add more resources to it? Maybe. Can we take out this phase and move it to, maybe another project? Maybe. That might be a conversation you can have. So those are negotiations that sometimes you can make. I won't say that project, will always win or help you win those negotiations, but it certainly helps. So many times I've talked to managers and they say, I know my project managers can get it done faster than what they're saying. Well, how do you know that? Have you seen the project schedule? Have you looked at that with them? So it's a tool. It's our tool as project managers to communicate what we're doing and what we plan to do with our managers, our team. The other thing that I put out here is to take time to figure out what needs to be done and break it up into manageable pieces. So this sort of feeds into one of the first ones that we talked about with using tasks that are between 8 and 80 hours. If you have a task that's just too large, one task that's 3 months, chances are you could further break that down a little bit. And that's another thing that sometimes folks will push back on and say, well, these tasks they're just arbitrary. You pulled these numbers out of the air, and sometimes we do. But if we can really decompose it down to meaningful tasks in relation to the duration of the schedule, then sometimes we have more ammunition and we get better support from our project that way. So let's see, we have a few minutes. Those are some of my favorite best practices, but again, those were just my observations and my best practices. So if there are any questions, please certainly feel free to either type them in the chat, or we have a few minutes now if you'd like to interrupt. Next month, we'll be talking about project sites and how they can help support your project. Project sites are really cool, and they sort of work hand in hand with your project schedule. So if you're using Project Online or Project Server, you have what's called project sites, and they're sort of a component of your project management efforts. So you have your schedule, and that's sort of your main project management artifact when we're working on a project. But then there's also other pieces that we need to track. We need maybe to track our risk mitigation. We need to track our issues list. We need to track our documents and deliverables. Things like that. So your project sites are a great way to have all of that information in one place that everybody can access. Everybody's working off of the same thing. So we'll go into a lot of detail about project sites and how they might be used to support your project. All right, we have a couple minutes and I don't see any questions in the chat portion of the room. Bob, did you want to give away our special prize?
I don't know. If I give it away, then I don't have it anymore.
Well, I know. But I know you have plenty.
No.
So
I'll tell you what, Patty, why don't you ask a question regarding what you just covered, and the first person to answer that wins a copy of Office Professional.
Oh, beautiful. Okay. Just as a little teaser, we were going to give it to the first person who asked a question. So since nobody asked it, you missed out. But just a little teaser for next month. So let's see. A good trivia question that I can ask. And the first person to answer this, either audio or in the chat, wins. So how about task durations? What's a typical task duration? I gave you a range. The typical task duration for best practices. Ah, Pam, you won. Yep, 8 to 40 hours. Perfect. All right, congratulations, Pam. We'll get you your copy of Office. All right, if there are no other questions, we can go ahead and wrap up for the day.
Yeah,
Thank
Pam,
you so much.
if you registered through Eventbrite and we've got your email there, we will contact you about getting this copy to you.
Beautiful. Thank you, Bob. If anybody has any questions, please don't hesitate to reach out to me directly. You see my email address here in the presentation. I'm always welcome to chat about any project management related topics. If you're stuck on something or just want to bounce some ideas off of me, please don't hesitate to reach out. All right, thanks everyone and have a great afternoon.